This section is titled The Anticommunist Crusade, and the focus question is, what effects did the anti-communism of the Cold War have on American politics and culture? The Cold War completely transformed American life. Society was permanently militarized. The military-industrial complex forged by World War II persisted and expanded. The United States retained a large and active federal government which spent billions on weapons and overseas bases. National security justified enormous government projects and expenditures, including aid to higher education and the building of a national highway system. It also made government officials secret and dishonest, leading, for example, to the covering up of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons tests conducted on U.S. soldiers and civilians. Cold War spending fostered economic growth and scientific and technological innovation that greatly shaped civilian life in medicine, computers, aircraft, and other products. Government research needs expanded higher education. The Cold War changed immigration policy to favor refugees from communist countries and increased pressure on American officials to minimize segregation. And the Cold War, like World War I, created a culture that sharply differentiated the loyal from the disloyal and eroded civil liberties. Dividing the world between liberty and slavery automatically made those who could be linked to communism enemies of freedom. In 1947, Truman created a loyalty review system in which federal employees had to prove their devotion to America without knowing who was accusing them of disloyalty and on what basis. Along with persons suspected of disloyalty, the new system also targeted homosexuals who worked for the federal government. Homosexuals were deemed particularly susceptible to Soviet blackmail, but ironically, the government conducted an anti-gay campaign at the same time that gay men enjoyed a powerful presence in the arts that were said to be expressions of American freedom. No espionage was revealed, but hundreds lost their jobs or resigned rather than be investigated. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, held hearings about communist influence in Hollywood. Celebrities and famous writers and directors were forced to appear before the committee or face punishment. Though some, like Ronald Reagan, alleged that the entertainment industry was rife with communism, others refused to testify, claiming that HUAC violated constitutional protections for free speech and political association. A group called the Hollywood 10 went to jail for contempt of Congress, and Hollywood blacklisted them and hundreds of others who were accused of communist sympathies or who refused to identify alleged communists. Several high-profile legal cases exacerbated the anti-communist craze. Whittaker Chambers, a Time magazine editor, charged that in the 1930s, Alger Hiss, a State Department official, had given him secret documents to take to Soviet agents. Hiss denied the allegations, but was convicted of perjury and served 5 years in prison. Richard Nixon, a young California congressman and a member of HUAC, achieved national prominence because of his pursuit of Hiss. The Truman administration put Communist Party leaders on trial for advocating revolution, and several were imprisoned. In 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, working-class Jewish communists from New York, were convicted of conspiring to pass secrets about the atomic bomb to the Soviets during World War II. The evidence against them was deemed too secret to be revealed at the time, but later it became clear that Julius had not given the secret of the bomb to the Soviets, and that almost no evidence supported charges against Ethel. Even though their charges were less serious than spying or treason, the judge said that they had helped cause the Korean War. They were sentenced to death and executed in 1953. Whether or not Hiss or the Rosenbergs were actually guilty, their trials strengthened Americans' sense that a massive spy network in the United States endangered the nation. This climate of fear allowed an obscure Wisconsin senator to lead a spurious anti-communist crusade. In 1950, Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, who was elected in 1946 partly because of a falsified war record, delivered a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, in which he claimed to have a list of 205 communists employed at the State Department. The charge was baseless. He constantly changed the numbers, and he never identified anyone who was actually disloyal. But McCarthy used his senatorial position to hold hearings and allege disloyalty at the Defense Department and other government agencies. Though many Republicans embraced McCarthy's campaign as a way to damage the Truman administration, his attacks on government officials after Republican candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president in 1952 alienated Republicans. Few politicians had the courage to speak up, but Maine's Margaret Chase Smith, the only woman in the Senate, condemned the, quote, campaign of hate and character assassination, end quote. In 1954, his allegations of disloyalty in the Army led to televised hearings that exposed McCarthy's tactics and led to his downfall. The Senate, with its Republican majority, condemned his action, and though McCarthy died 3 years later, McCarthyism, as it came to be known, continued to be used to refer to the abuse of power in the name of anti-communism. Although anti-communism most affected the national government, it pervaded local government and life as well. States created committees, based on HUAC, to ferret out alleged communists, and state and local authorities required loyalty oaths of teachers, pharmacists, and other professionals. Private groups like the American Legion and the National Association of Manufacturers also targeted individuals for their political beliefs. Organizations that had been influenced by communists in the 1930s and 1940s became tainted, and those who would not testify about their past and present political opinions or refused to name communists often lost their jobs. Books that were considered to be un-American, like stories of Robin Hood, were removed from local libraries. Universities refused to host left-wing speakers and fired teachers who would not take loyalty oaths. The courts did nothing to halt these violations of civil liberties, and the Supreme Court defended the imprisonment of communists for their beliefs. Though Soviet spies certainly were in the United States, the minuscule Communist Party did not endanger American security. Most of those jailed or fired in the McCarthy era were guilty only of holding unpopular beliefs and engaging in lawful political activity. Anti-communism was a popular mass movement that had its uses. One basis was in ethnic groups with roots in Eastern European countries dominated by the Soviets, like the Polish, and among American Catholics who opposed communist hostility to religion. Government agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by J. Edgar Hoover, used anti-communism to increase their power. Anti-communism was also used for purely partisan political purposes. McCarthy and other anti-communist leaders seemed to criticize the legacy of Roosevelt and the New Deal more than they did Stalin and communism. Many Democrats embraced anti-communism to deflect Republican allegations of disloyalty. The Democrats also excluded many on the left and the Popular Front who had helped organize support for New Deal policies. Anti-communism made conformity the new definition of loyalty. Any criticism of the status quo now appeared subversive. Business used anti-communism against unions. White supremacists used it against black civil rights, and others used it to defend sexual morality and traditional gender roles against feminism and homosexuality. Anti-communism, most pervasive from the late 1940s to the early 1960s, powerfully shaped American politics and culture. Republicans invoked communism to stymie Truman's political program. Truman became alarmed by excesses of anti-communism, and he seemed to retreat from it in policies and government. In 1950, he vetoed a measure that required so-called subversive groups to register with the government, denied passports to their members, and authorized the president to deport or detain them. In 1952, a new immigration law called the McCarran-Walter Act was also passed over Truman's veto, and it shot down Truman's proposals for immigration reform and allowed the deportation of communists even if they were citizens. In 1954, the federal government's Operation Wetback resulted in the military deportation of about 1 million Mexican Americans alleged to be illegal aliens. Truman only barely expanded the coverage of Social Security, and instead of extending federal social welfare, private welfare prevailed. Union workers' contracts provided them with health insurance, wage increases that followed the cost of living, pensions, and paid vacation. But only workers in the unionized heavy industries enjoyed these benefits in America. In Europe, all workers received these benefits from the government. The non-unionized majority of the population did not receive these benefits, a situation that created increasing inequality among laboring Americans. All political and social groups had to comply with anti-communism or be destroyed, and this severely damaged the labor and civil rights movements that had benefited from dedicated communist organizers. After the 1947 passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which withdrew bargaining rights and legal protections from unions whose leaders refused to swear that they weren't communist, the CIO expelled left-wing unions with nearly 1 million members. Unions began to support Cold War U.S. foreign policies. Since left-wingers were often the most militant advocates of women's rights and civil rights, their expulsion left unions unable to respond to the civil rights movement and an economy that shifted from manufacturing to service work. The civil rights movement changed. While major civil rights groups at first protested Truman's loyalty program and criticized anti-communists for not defining racism as un-American, nearly all black leaders and civil rights organizations were pressured into joining the Anticommunist Crusade. Groups like the Southern Conference for Human Welfare that had united communists and non-communists in a struggle for both racial equality and social justice disintegrated, leaving only legalistic groups like the NAACP. Black organizations adopted Cold War language to argue that segregation and racism in the United States gave credence to Soviet criticisms of America, and thus helped solidify Cold War understandings of freedom. In a climate of anti-communism and McCarthyism, criticisms of American policy, domestic or foreign, invited a harsh response. Truman's civil rights program faltered, but the booming economy of the 1950s, which produced an affluent society in America for the first time, produced a widening gap between white affluence and black poverty and disenfranchisement that would help inspire a civil rights resurgence in the 1960s.